Hello and welcome to Blockchain Gaming World, episode 179. I'm your host, John Jordan. Don't forget to check out my daily email. You can find that at gamestx.substack.com. In today's episode, I'm talking to Tarrence Van Az, who is the co-founder at Cartridge. So Cartridge is a development studio making tools for fully on-chain games. And in fact, Tarrence started out making fully on-chain games and then, as is often the case, realised some of the problems and difficulties, which is why Cartridge came about. It recently raised $7.5 million in funding to help it on its way. And it is building out a whole bunch of tools, including one called Dojo, which just allows developers to make blockchain games, fully on-chain games, in a much more holistic and hopefully efficient way. So we talk about Tarrence's sort of experiences so far, his career in the industry, and also we dive a little bit into my opinion that while fully on-chain games are very interesting conceptually, they are sort of struggling, I think, in terms of getting people to actually play them and to be accessible. So that's what's in today's episode. Don't forget, every Wednesday we are putting out new episodes, so do subscribe, don't miss out. But on with the show. Hello everyone and welcome to the show. Very pleased I have Tarrence from Cartridge on the show. How's it going?
Hey, doing well, John. Thanks for having me.
Good. So we are going to be talking generally about fully on-chain games today and why they matter, and talking specifically about what Cartridge is doing in that sort of sector. But before we kick into that, going to find out a bit more about the interviewee. So Tarrence, can you give us a bit of a potted history about how you've ended up the CEO of a fully on-chain game tech company?
Hey, yeah, definitely. So my journey, to kind of take you back to the beginning, I have a technical background, and I got into software development and game development and stuff at a very young age when I was, playing around with computers and messing around with, the things that kids do, and continued pursuing that throughout my career. I studied computer science engineering at the University of Michigan and got introduced to Bitcoin back then in 2013. Okay. And have been involved in the industry in various capacities and in both verticals in different ways ever since then. Purchased my first Bitcoin in 2013, built some Bitcoin wallet stuff like very early on. I got involved in the Ethereum ecosystem in 2015 and built a bunch of smart contract stuff. And then in parallel had more traditional software engineering career. I did some game development stuff while at university, and then joined a software as a service company called Box out of college, and then joined Magic Leap and worked there on mixed reality, pushing these types of interactive experiences. I did a bunch of deep learning research on 3D world reconstruction from egocentric cameras. And then about 3 years ago, those worlds all collided when a couple friends and I worked on releasing the Dope Wars ecosystem, which was an NFT that were released very shortly after the Loot NFT, actually the next day. That was focused more on, kind of the street culture and was heavily inspired by this classic game called Drug Wars, which was a very early MS-DOS game and has existed in a bunch of different platforms since then. A lot of people have a shared experience of playing it on like a TI-83 calculator. The game itself is like very well suited for the blockchain. It's basically an arbitrage game. You go between different locations. You buy low, sell high. It's like a gamified version of a lot of the different things that we see on chain already with things like AMMs. And so we set out to build a fully on chain version of this game. Simple enough to be on the blockchain and fits well into kind of the existing audience of types of applications that people are interested in playing on the blockchain, but complex enough that it didn't fit neatly, or it wasn't practically possible on like a layer one, like Ethereum at the time. And so someone came to the ecosystem and shared basically Starknet and this interesting technology with zero knowledge proofs and their ability to scale the amount of computation possible on chain that would actually make it practically possible for us to put a game fully on chain, a game where the entire logic and the state exists on chain. Either it can be executed on chain or it can be verified on chain. And so that was really, kind of like our entry point into Cartridge, this realization that there was technologies coming down the pipeline that fundamentally changed this dynamic and increased the amount of computation and expanded the design space of what was possible on chain. But there was a lot to do to be able to put it in the hands of developers and players. And so we founded Cartridge now about 2.5 years ago to solve this problem, to push kind of what is possible on chain and allow a bunch of different teams in the ecosystem to start building these games much more rapidly. And I can share a little bit more about the stuff that we're working on, but that's kind of how we got to where we are today.
Cool, good. So I guess it's always interesting when people who are sort of making a game come across some sort of problem and then decide they're going to sort of solve that problem, and they sort of make the switch from building a game, which is one thing, to building a sort of a tech or an engine or however you want to call it, and those skills are not exactly the same. So and certainly the business models are not exactly the same. So did that seem just quite a obvious thing for you guys to do? You just sort of like, blockchain's very experimental, so we're just moving from one thing to the next, or was that a bit more of a sort of decision to be made? Because games companies are very focused on obviously sort of consumers, and B2B companies, tech companies have to be very focused on a different sort of audience.
Yeah, so just to understand the question, you're saying like the idea, the kind of the decision to build tooling and infrastructure versus content. Yeah. So I'd say, we started out like focusing very much on content and the technologies necessary to enable them with the Dope Wars game. And we have continuously used that game to dog food a lot of our technology. And so like we set out building this game like 2.5-3 years ago now, and have like a new version of it, like using all the latest Dojo tooling and Cartridge tooling. And it's, significantly better user experience and been much easier to build. But at this point, like from an organizational perspective, we have so many teams building on top of the tool chain and the technology that we built initially to enable like ecosystems like Dope Wars and Realms. We can maybe talk a little bit more about like the history of the tool chain itself. That it makes more sense for us right now to service like the needs of all of those teams building. It's a whole new medium, and there needs to be a lot of different experimentation around these new affordances it brings to the table. And I think like the best chance of us finding success is to have a lot of at-bats, right? And so enable a lot of teams to try different things. And so that's why our focus has shifted more towards like maintaining and enabling these teams and building content ourselves.
And as you sort of already mentioned, you were building on Starknet, which is sort of one of the early sort of L2s. Obviously there's sort of loads of them now, and they all have sort of different trajectories. And you're much more qualified than me to talk about that. But was it just the case that you sort of Starknet was one you sort of looked at early on, and you thought we'll go with that, or how does that really matter which one it is? How does that sort of process happen? Because on the game side, at least, we see quite a lot now of sort of games migrating between different blockchains, maybe L1s to L2s or L2s to L3s or something like that. But obviously, as a tech provider, I guess you can't just be messing around and changing chains all the time. So So why is Starknet, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yeah. So I think, most of the other games in the blockchain space are primarily focused on, they have like, just like kind of blockchain light, like they have just like assets on chain, and all the actual complex stuff happens off chain. And for them, it doesn't really matter which blockchain they're using, right, in that sense. And they're using just primarily EVM blockchains. And as you mentioned, there's quite poor differentiation between them. And it's ultimately either about like distribution in the audience, or just grants and how much money a chain is willing to give someone to convince them to like, use their RPC versus a different RPC. It's a kind of commoditized in a large sense. So our decision to build on top of Starknet was informed by different requirements. We want to build fully on-chain games, and bringing this level of computation on-chain requires like technology that didn't exist at the time. And Starkware and Starks, at the time when we made this decision, and I still have like strong conviction it's the right decision, and we've seen it playing more and more out over time, but was the only provider of this technology, because Starks were invented by Starkware. And since then, a bunch of other people have adopted their technology, and it's kind of become more consensus that their approach to zero knowledge Starks with hashing-based approaches is ultimately the best approach to essentially enabling like this exponential increase of computation on chain. But the Starkware team, being the inventor of it, right, and the first the team that has brought these into production and has invented a whole bunch of other things around it that basically like focuses on from a first principles perspective, like the kind of constraints and the resource limitations that are inherent to this like kind of new computational paradigm, means that in the case of games, which are the most complex types of applications, you want specifically tailored languages around the properties of zero-knowledge Starks, where, for example, they can be much more expensive to prove computations than traditional like computation, to enable these things to live fully on chain. So, I mean, I think it's a combination of, at the time, they were the only kind of horse in town. I think like their approach with the Cairo VM and Cairo, the language that is designed specifically around Starks, is going to allow us to do more complicated things than other languages where they essentially are trying to, you know, for example, wrap the EVM in something that can generate like a zero knowledge proof, or something that targets other instruction sets. And they've demonstrated time and time again that they can, you know, as necessary, push the kind of the frontier of what's possible with this new technology, and then ship it into production. They recently demonstrated that with Circle Starks, like the most efficient prover that exists right now, and is going to be like a huge unlock for the type of experiences we can bring on chain. So there's you know, from a very technology perspective, why we decided that the technology that Starkware is building with Starknet, with Cairo, and zero knowledge proofs is the right thing to try and bring these types of experiences on chain.
Mm-hmm. Cool, good. So we'll move away from the technology. I can just see you're gonna do a deep dive and gonna lose me straight away there. But so I guess the thing that sort of matters, I suppose, for people who play games is why do these games have to be fully on chain? You know, I think we've seen a trend towards that over the last sort of 6 months to a year. Various different sort of flavors of that, I guess, at a technical level. But for the vast majority of sort of games, Web3 games or games that use blockchain assets, clearly aren't fully on chain. You know, I guess you always get arguments about, is this game fully on chain or not, and I guess people in your position would sort of have different views on that. But just as a general thing, you know, what experiences are we getting with fully on chain games that we don't get if we have just our assets on Ethereum and everything else is sort of happening, you know, centralized?
Yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of it is about the removal of platform risk, right? Okay. I mean, I think there's a few different value propositions, and there's a bunch of hypotheses, and I think like multiple of them can be true. I think, you know, from a developer experience, what we've seen is that the blockchain as like a shared infrastructure provider can significantly reduce the amount of resources necessary to bring a game to market. So in traditional game development, you have to manage, like, for example, your own backend services. You have to figure out payment rails. You have to figure out like a bunch of just more operational like technology side of things that distracts from the content creation side of things to be able to bring a game to market. In the blockchain space, like we've seen in the DeFi space, where it's a similar analog, right? Like if you want to bring like a traditional financial application to market, you have a ton of like compliance and banking and all kinds of like other things that you have to focus on that detract from the core product that you're trying to build. And in DeFi, it's different, right? Like you can just write a smart contract overnight. You can inherit like the trust of the blockchain, the infrastructure that it runs on, the payment rails that it runs on, and you can take something from zero to hundreds of millions of dollars in like a very short duration of time. It's unheard of in the traditional financial space, right? And I think the same is true as far as some of the affordances that the blockchain brings to game developers, the ability to focus on like interesting core game loops and content experiences, and to ship them onto a blockchain, deploy them as a smart contract, and let them scale up like very quickly and be able to like almost like atomically capture that value that you're creating, but through the native payment rails in the blockchain. Without like all these additional resources. So from a developer experience perspective, I think it provides like a ton of leverage to game developers. I think like another thing is that it brings to the table is this idea of removing platform risk that we traditionally have in, you know, centralized published like kind of game paradigms, where a publisher where the players, but also developers, have a very different type of relationship with like the entity creating the content, right? Like from a developer perspective, you can't really build an organization on top of an existing game because there's just too much platform risk. Like it's almost impossible to raise money for a mod on top of a game, and we've seen this play out many times in the history of the gaming ecosystem, right? Like it's better to take a mod and spawn an entirely new franchise or IP around it than to try and build it sustainably on top of an existing franchise, because like in the mandate of essentially like published title is for them to capture that value, right? So as soon as they see someone, I mean, most recently we saw this with hardcore mode in World of Warcraft, right? Like as soon as someone creates something on top of it that creates value, like they need to internalize that value capture. They can't let it leak outside of their ecosystem. And blockchains let you make like a very credible commitment that you won't do this, right? Like it's very transparent and legible to all the participants, especially the developers, of what is the process to change like some fundamental building block, or maybe it can't change, maybe it's immutable, right? Or if like the original person who created the game decides that they don't want to continue publishing it, and someone who built something on top of it actually has created like a successful new experience on top of it, they can choose to operate the underlying infrastructure for this gaming ecosystem. And so from a developer experience perspective, like being able to take advantage of existing primitives and gaming audiences that already exist in the blockchain, build new experiences on top of them, like kind of at almost like a UGC level, and use those for the distribution, and while still being able to capture the value that you're creating through the payment rails of the blockchain, and not having to worry about like the inherent platform risk that is inherent to centrally published titles. Yeah. And then those organizations, as a virtue of that, become like investable by external capital as well. So you can imagine like over time these ecosystems like form in an emergent way, just like completely different to what we've seen in the traditional game development space. And then from a player perspective, I think like removing platform risk, again, like massively alters the relationship that players have with these digital worlds that they interact with, right? I think like today, people spend a ton of time and resources in these digital worlds, but they basically don't have any say in how they're operated and how they evolve over time. And it's kind of like crazy to me in a certain sense that people are willing to commit so many resources and time to these digital experiences without concrete guarantees about like how they function and operate, right? And how like their achievements might be diluted in the future or even fail to exist in a few years from today. And so, one of the interesting affordances of the blockchain is like this persistence and removable platform risk. And, again, the same like legibility of like the process for how these things might change in the future, that from what we've seen of people involved in the ecosystem, people are willing to spend significantly more time and resources in a game where they have concrete kind of guarantees around their relationship with like the core content and how it might evolve and how their participation in it affects the whole and might change over time.
Yeah, good. So you made some strong points there, and I think that's broadly reflected in why there has been sort of this explosion in fully on-chain games as a concept. I guess one of the criticisms of it would be that it seems to work really well for a certain sort of genre of game, and it gets sort of maybe people like us quite excited, but we're sort of a niche within a niche. So in general, these sort of games don't have, I suppose no blockchain game has a mass audience. we would probably argue at the moment, but fully on-chain games are sort of like a niche within the niche. And as I say, the games that sort of work seem to be sort of taking that route are ones with sort of lots of sort of resources. So you have lots of sort of like crafting and lots of trading of these resources, and you're going out and finding resources. So it's quite grindy sort of RPGs. I'm sure you can make any sort of game sort of fully on chain, I suppose, if you design it well enough. But it seems to be that sort of genre is what I see sort of most of. So do you think those are valid criticisms? How would you sort of counter that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're very early on in kind of like the technology's development. There's, Cartridge is one of the few teams pushing on like enabling more of these types of genres to come on chain. I would say already today, there's some priors that people have from what was possible on like Ethereum or and blockchain technology, especially with like zero knowledge proofs, has improved significantly since then. So for example, in the Dojo toolchain, we provide Katana, which is a sequencer for on-chain games, and it can taking advantage of zero knowledge proofs, we can do deployments close to users for low latency. We have basically like instant transaction inclusion. And from a user experience and the developer experience perspective, it starts to look much more similar to like a traditional games development, but you can generate a proof that like attests to, the correctness of like your dungeon run or whatever, and then allows you to bring that on chain. And so we're like massively expanding the design space of what is possible on chain. We're still not at the point where you could like, put an FPS and have every bullet on chain. Like that's, it's still too computationally expensive. And mostly just from an economic perspective, right, of like what is the proving costs of this computation, like not a fundamental limitation around what is like technically possible, like for the throughput, because with these new architectures, you can essentially do like the same thing that you can do in the traditional game space. You just have generating a zero knowledge proof is a more expensive computational like operation, and you have to justify the expense of it, right? So even in the case of FPS, if you had like the Counter-Strike like world champion game, and you wanted to prove that one and put that as an artifact, and there was enough people that were interested in having that as like an artifact on the blockchain that could be like live forever, you could justify it. But for like every game, probably doesn't make sense. So I think a lot of the perspectives of what's possible on chain have strong priors from what was possible on Ethereum or on these like shared global execution contexts with like relatively slow blockchains, block times, and like zero sum like resource competition with like DeFi and stuff like that. The new architectures that we're building with Dojo and Cartridge like fundamentally remove those limitations, and while still enabling you to take advantage and inherit all the like affordances that you want from a blockchain.
Okay, good. I guess you've mentioned some of these things a few times, so it may be just good to have a certain point here to talk specifically about Cartridge. So you've mentioned Dojo. I know there are other things, a slot and controller, and you mentioned Katana as well. So maybe a good opportunity now to tell us a little bit about Cartridge and the sort of the tech it offers and how it works together and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, so I mean, we're focused on bringing this new medium to life, and it's really like a 0 to 1 type of moment, and we've had to execute in a bunch of different dimensions to make this possible. We have Dojo, which is an fully open source, community-driven tool chain for building on-chain games. It incorporates like a few different components. One is the Dojo syntax itself and the architecture itself, like the on-chain representation of worlds, where you get like modularity, extensibility, composability, persistence by default by just building with Dojo. It primarily focuses on the back-end logic of a game. So typically what would live in like an AWS or GCP, like in a centralized server, is now like developed in Dojo and deployed to a blockchain. And the language itself and the macros and significantly reduces the overhead of doing this. It'll look very familiar for any developer coming from a traditional gaming background. Then we have like a few different pieces of the tool chain. We have Sozo, which is essentially like a migration manager. It takes care of like creating a representation of the world that you have locally, and then diffing that with the world on chain and applying the migrations and the access control and everything necessary to put that, like deploy that world onto a blockchain. We have Katana, which is the sequencer that we've developed specifically focused on the gaming use case and this idea of execution sharding, of providing like dedicated execution context for a particular session of a game that is low latency, high throughput. We have Tori, which is what's called an automatic indexer, and it'll take the world that you've deployed on chain and generate a gRPC and GraphQL API that provides real-time bindings to the on-chain state. So you can get like all the state changes from the blockchain with very low latency into the client. We have, and as part of that, have binding generation. So you can generate, like, for example, an SDK for Unity or for, in JavaScript or TypeScript or whatever, that is fully typed with respect to like the models and stuff that exists on chain. And then we have Saya, which is like a settlement orchestrator. So there's a bunch of different technologies that are necessary to make this possible. I know it's a lot. And so Saya basically is responsible for taking some execution, like a dungeon run, and generating what's called an execution trace and a zero knowledge proof of the correctness of its execution. So you can, do like a multi-core run or whatever, prove that you defeated Ragnaros, and then you can settle that on chain and unlock the loot from that battle. But like everyone else in the blockchain doesn't need to know that of like every single sequence of events that happen for you to like defeat the boss, right? Which itself is is actually a kind of cool property. Like you can keep your strategy hidden. And so those are the components of the Dojo toolchain. And anyone can get started with these super easy, like locally on their machine and stand up everything with development. And then the tooling that we've developed at Cartridge essentially is focused on taking those games that people have developed locally and bringing them into production, like scaling them to large audiences. So we have Slot, which allows you, is essentially like the execution layer for on-chain games with Dojo. It allows you to deploy Katana and Saya instances very quickly into our infrastructure. It takes a couple seconds, and then you can deploy your games to those and you can start playing them with other people. And then we have Controller, which is essentially like an account or wallet specifically for the on-chain gaming use case. Again, that abstracts a lot of the complexity of the backend infrastructure. So Controller is like a self-custodial wallet that takes advantage of like the secure enclave and WebAuthn and session tokens and all of these like cool new technologies enabled by account abstraction to provide like a really great user experience for players. It's cross-platform. You can try it out and get signed up in just like literally a couple of seconds. We use paymasters to abstract like the fees for users, so we can, for example, have like with the slot infrastructure, you can also have like free-to-play kind of models for people to onboard onto games. And so, you can build a game with Dojo, you can deploy it with Slot, and people can start playing it very quickly with Controller. Yeah. Those are the big components of the stack that we're focused on developing right now.
Yeah. And in terms of sort of the ecosystem you're building up, I know you had a sort of I don't know what you call it, like an incubator sort of period of time where you had a whole bunch of developers in. So can you talk a little bit about sort of who's using it and what sort of games are being made and sort of what stage they're at the moment?
Yeah, so I mean we have quite a growing developer ecosystem at this point. It's really exciting. We've kind of reached an inflection point where there's just like new games showing up on Twitter being like, like we're building with Dojo, and I'm like, oh, that's cool. I had no idea. Which is an exciting place to be. We're actually hosting a residency program here in New York right now where we have 30 of the top developers in the ecosystem here over the next 2 months working on their games and refining them and working on shipping them into production with Dojo. We have, inside of the Dojo ecosystem, we have the Realms ecosystem, which is spawned out of the Loot universe, and there's a bunch of different teams building in the context of the Realms, like kind of universe right now. There's, Pistols at 10 Blocks. There's like the Eternum game, which is more of like a RPG, like resource management type game. There's Loot Survivor, which is like a dungeon crawler game. There's like a Blobberts Arena, which is like a kind of auto battler type game. And then there's like Force Prime. Outside of the Realms ecosystem, there's a bunch of other games. Force Prime, which is a really cool game that's being developed. There's Pave. There's just so many to say off the top of my head. There's the Dope Boys game, of course. And I feel like the Archetypal team has been building it. They've built a game on a bunch of different on-chain gaming tool chains, and are building one on top of the Dojo tool chain right now called Oregon Trail. What else is? Oh yeah, there's one code.
We'll put a link in.
Yeah.
And obviously, I guess it's one of these things we often say in the space. We're early, and I guess you're saying sort of you're early. You're still sort of building out your tool chain, and then getting devs in is early. But sort of back to my point where I think there are like maybe 1,000 people who are really interested in blockchain games, and it's sort of the same 1,000 people sort of recycle through all these games. Seems to be the case. I mean, as much as you can predict these things, what's the case for these things becoming, having 10,000 or 100,000 players? Is it something to do more with the education broadly in the game system? Is it something to do with the sort of tech that you're providing? Is it just sort of devs need a couple of years to build these experiences to the level? A combination of all three. I mean, when do we expect the fully on-chain game side to move from sort of interesting tech to actually just games that people are just like, oh, great game?
Yeah, I mean, I think like generally we see, inside the blockchain space and even more broadly of like a big shift towards like more speculative type games.
Yes.
And I think, with sports gambling or, in poker and all these, more, I don't want to say casino type games, like, because it's not necessarily, it's still skill-based things. And I think there's obviously a cohort of users that we've yet to win in the on-chain gaming space, which is just like the existing kind of speculative, like trader audience, the people that are today playing pumped up fun and stuff like that, which is, for a lot of intents and purposes, an on-chain game. So I think like, in the short term, it will be useful for us or important for us to demonstrate that we can at least capture this like blockchain native audience with essentially like more immersive, like more gamified experiences that kind of like tickle the same itch in a sense, or scratch the same itch, I guess, in a sense. And then I think more broadly, I think a lot of games become essentially, you can build games that are more compelling, like in a more competitive ecosystem on top of the blockchain by inheriting, like by being able to focus on these core content loops and being able to remove like a lot of the overhead that's traditionally associated, especially in the indie scene where we see so many developers like struggling to bring games to market, like finding the resources to take a game like is actually an interesting concept and ship it out there and attract an audience. And I think there's a lot of like interesting distribution innovations that are possible with the blockchain that will help bridge that gap through, we've seen with blockchain technology through tokenization that you have this ability to, in a lot of cases, solve cold start problems. Like the problem is we've seen a lot of teams focus only on innovating in that dimension, and basically issuing NFTs way before a game is ready, and then failing or struggling to convert that initial like activation energy into like actual players of the game and building like a sustainable game for the long term. I think we will see a lot more of using those similar types of techniques, but when a game is actually ready and you can actually use that as like user acquisition, and you can convert like a lot of this like initial like speculative audience and use them to like drive, essentially like bypass like this cold start problem, build like bootstrap your initial audience of participants, and then convert those into long-term sustainable games. And I think like by having a more competitive kind of user acquisition model, as well as then like these more player-centric like affordances or features of the universe where people maybe are more willing to spend time and money in them because there's less platform risk presented by like the publishers underneath. I think we'll start to see like more successes in that realm, and I think that's like one interesting path to like a larger scale kind of adoption of an on-chain game. And then I think in the UGC vertical, again, like there's, I think, a lot of potential, but it's going to take some time to kind of lay the foundations for it. But if you think about like just some of the way that developers in UGC content ecosystems like Roblox and Fortnite Creator and Minecraft today kind of interact with these ecosystems and the significant amount of platform risk they take on and the inaccessible for a large amount of developers and the large fees that they're taking, and even just like in a certain sense like the amount of success you need to have to even be able to start to like earn money in those ecosystems, and kind of like the crude like the way that the monetization models work for content creators are very shoehorned into the existing model, and like the interesting things that you can do with a blockchain where you have essentially the ability to like massively innovate on how content creators or contributors to these ecosystems are rewarded for their contributions. I think we'll start to see a lot more innovations in that realm, and just through like having a more competitive ecosystem of people trying to build games that they can monetize and bring those to users. We'll, I think, almost naturally see better experiences created by just having just more competition.
Yeah. No, I think it's sort of, for what it's worth, sort of my view on fully on-chain games has sort of always been at some point in the future, when the technology allows, everything will be fully on chain. Because if you have that ability, why wouldn't you do it? You want whatever it means, whatever the chain means, whether it's an L, I don't know, an L15 or something. Exactly what that means. But everything's going to go that way. But the length of time it's going to take to get there seems sort of really indeterminate. Because you're always sort of trying to, as you were saying, you're always like thinking in your head, why does it make sense to put this transaction on chain, and what's the cost of that? And obviously it's going to be more than doing it on AWS or whatever it is at the moment. So there's that sort of period of time where people are having to make that decision about what they want to do with the transaction, and where they want to put it. So.
I mean, for sure. I think, we have to remove that overhead, like that mental burden of making a decision every single time you interact with the game, right? Mm-hmm. Like there will obviously be times when you interact with a game where it's a high value transaction, and then you want the user to be aware that it's a high value transaction. But for the most part, you don't want them to be thinking of this is like a half a cent. Like, and if the fees are low enough, you can essentially just abstract that all, right? And it could just be built into kind of your model. Like, how do you monetize your game? Like, you make money on the high value transactions, you fully subsidize all the low value transactions, and it looks much more, again, like a traditional game in a lot of senses, right? With just like some superpowers.
Yeah, good. Lovely. Well, thank you very much for your time, Tarrence. It was a good explanation there. We didn't go too far into the tech stuff, so I hope we didn't lose the audience. So, got a good sort of vision of where we think we might be going.
Awesome. Well, yeah, great being on here. Thank you for having me.
And I guess maybe keep an eye on those 30 projects, and at the end of that sort of period of time, we'll be looking to see who's made it out and what games we should be checking out as well. So something to the residency wraps up September 25th, and we're going to have like a big showcase and a Dojo day, and we'll share a lot more of that more broadly on our socials. You can follow at Ohio_Dojo, OHAYO_Dojo, or Cartridge_GG is like the social is the best place to stay in tune with the ecosystem. And if anyone is interested in learning more, either on the development side or whatever, feel free to reach out to me. Happy to chat, introduce you to people in the ecosystem. Cool. Good. We'll put all that in the show notes, all the links through, so people can get that. And
awesome.
So thanks to Tarrence for his time. Thanks to you for watching, listening, however you are consuming the podcast. Every week, putting out new episodes to the people who are building out this new way of building and playing games. So don't miss out. Do subscribe, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Cheers.